"Jump," the press photographer instructed the city officials. They were huddled together for a photo at the January 2019 grand opening of the Philadelphia Housing Authority's new $45 million headquarters. "It's a jewel of a building," exclaimed Philadelphia's Mayor Jim Kenney. The new headquarters sat on 300 parcels of land that the Housing Authority, known as PHA, had taken by eminent domain from North Philadelphia's poorest residents. The building had modern design, large glass windows, beautiful landscaping, and a spacious rooftop deck. The jewel of a building is surrounded on all sides by vacant, blighted public housing. These houses were once home to Philadelphia's Sharwood residents. The proximity of the expensive new headquarters to the blighted homes illustrates the gap in wealth between the PHA executives and the people the agency is tasked with housing. The jewel that Mayor Kenney referenced was in fact a diamond in the rough. "Jump" was also what a PHA official said to Regina Cretin when she asked what to do if she needed to escape fire in her crowded PHA home that lacked enough fire exits. Regina had been voicing concerns for 2 years about the lack of fire escapes in her PHA-owned property. If one of the overcrowded row homes caught fire, there are not enough fire escapes to allow all inhabitants to safely exit the building. She worried that this would lead to fatalities. There has been a steady reallocation of public resources away from families who need safe and affordable housing and to executive headquarters, their salaries, and their developer cronies. This leads to tragedy, such as the one that happened on January 5th, 2022 in Philadelphia. Only a mile from the PHA jewel of a headquarters and a few blocks from Regina Cretin's PHA house, sat a PHA home that housed 26 people. The 8-bedroom house was bursting at the seams. There were only 2 fire exits. The house, as Regina Cretin had been warning, was unprepared for a fire. The 2 families who crowded into this PHA house were a tight-knit bunch with limited resources. Still, they did their best to decorate their cramped home for Christmas. But then tragedy struck. It was the 3-year anniversary of the grand opening of PHA's Jewel. While the headquarters sat mostly empty, the 2 families crammed in the PHA home were rendered helpless when their Christmas tree caught fire. The fire engulfed the entire duplex. 13 people perished. 8 of them were children. The youngest was a 2-year-old baby. These people were unable to just jump to safety. These deaths were preventable. When a PHA representative was asked why 26 people were crowded into a home that was meant for half of its occupancy, he replied that there just aren't enough affordable houses to meet the need. But PHA owns vacant houses, and they also have their own private police force. The money that they spend keeping out squatters, they could spend rehabbing their housing inventory and placing families in them. The lack of safe and affordable housing leads to preventable tragedies like Philadelphia's house fire that killed 13 people, as well as the premature death of hundreds of people experiencing homelessness on the streets. These tragedies are a result of national policy and legislation that frames housing as a commodity rather than a human right. We currently commodify everything we need to survive except air. And if private equity firms could figure out how to sell air, they absolutely would. It wasn't always like this. From the 1940s, when President Franklin Roosevelt declared a second Bill of Rights that included the right to a decent home, all the way through the 1970s, affordable housing was within reach for all of us. Under the more recent framework of housing as a commodity, policymakers have demolished affordable housing and redistributed land to residents able to pay the ever-increasing market rate for housing. This trend was enshrined in the 2005 Supreme Court decision, Kelo versus New London, which gave county councils the authority to acquire people's private homes, sometimes through force, and give it to private corporations for profit. U.S. citizens were told that public good now included corporate profit. Poor homeowners be damned. This is one recent law out of many that has contributed to a reallocation of housing away from the poor and to the rich. In Philadelphia, all of our land agencies that distribute public land and money have wealthy developers on their boards. These developers then vote to give themselves public resources. This is obviously a conflict of interest, but it's not actually illegal. We need a law to change that. While housing has become less affordable, wages have been stagnant for over a decade. Nearly half of all Americans make wages that don't cover their basic living expenses. It is now impossible for anyone in the U.S. making the federal minimum wage to afford rent in a one-bedroom home. In the classic story of wealth inequality, A Christmas Carol, Bob Cratchit makes 15 shillings a week. Adjusted for inflation, that's $13.50 an hour. That's almost double today's federal minimum wage. On today's low wages, Bob Cratchit and his son Tiny Tim would likely be homeless. 5.7 million Cratchit families are housing insecure today. We need a law to change that. In the United States, we have 4.4 million families on public and subsidized housing wait lists. Wait times usually exceed a decade. Meanwhile, we have 4 vacant houses for every 1 unhoused person. Most houses are consolidated in the hands of a few massive investment banks and equity firms. In Philadelphia, according to Pew Trusts, only 2% of all landlords own over half of all rental properties. When we have 43% of the entire nation that is housing insecure, while we have empty homes, we do not have a housing crisis. We have a profiteering crisis. When 53 cents on every federal dollar goes to war, while 3 cents on every dollar goes to housing assistance for the poor, we don't have a resource shortage. We have a priority crisis. These priorities are not in crisis by accident. Since Ronald Reagan's presidency and his introduction of the racist trope of the welfare queen, war spending has skyrocketed, while affordable housing funding has plummeted. It should be no surprise that housing and homelessness disparately impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities because of their historic and current exclusion from housing. Ending homelessness is possible if we shift our laws and policies away from housing as profit and towards housing as a right. Housing as a right means freedom from the cruel and unusual punishment of criminalizing homeless encampments in the absence of adequate alternatives. Housing as a right will lead to better health outcomes because housed people are healthier people. It will lead to greater racial justice when disparately homeless and poor Black, Indigenous, people of color are not thrown in jail or subjected to crippling fines and fees for simply trying to sleep or shelter themselves outside. Housing as a right means ensuring safe and affordable housing for all. The right to housing has gained wide popularity. In fact, 3/4 of Americans polled report that they believe housing is a human right. And 2/3 believe government programs need to be expanded to ensure the right to housing. Once thought of as radical, a housing justice movement has normalized rights-based language of housing. Housing rights advocates and social movements have won hard-fought battles across the world. These include getting international bodies such as the United Nations and religious bodies such as the U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops and Pope Francis to call on governments to immediately implement housing as a human right. Movements in countries such as France, South Africa, Finland, and Scotland have won the adoption of housing rights language in their constitutions or legislation. In Scotland, the rights-based language has been the backbone of policies that have made homelessness in this country brief, rare, and non-reoccurring. People are also fighting this battle in every U.S. city today. Our numbers are growing, but to be successful, we need your support and action. Our primary strategy is to build a mass people-powered movement that will change the decision-makers' calculus. Right now, a few hoarders and their bought politicians are reaping all the rewards. They want status quo, but we have numbers on our side. Our locally and nationally focused disruption can change the equation. Bill Moyers outlines the crucial 4 roles required for social movement success. They are the advocate, the helper, the organizer, and the rebel. In our advocacy role, we can call on our housing authorities to direct their public funding toward home inspections and making repairs, rather than building new multi-million-dollar headquarters. We can demand those we elect fight to lower rents and raise wages. We can protect renters from eviction or foreclosure and provide tenants with legal representation in the courts to enforce these protections. We can demand a just and fair allocation of our tax dollars, away from militarism and profiteers and towards public housing and universal subsidized housing. In our organizer role, we can spread the word and enlist others in the movement. When our local governments punish people for sleeping on the streets when no alternative housing exists, we can put our bodies between law enforcement and those who need shelter. We can organize litigation and protect the unhoused in the courts. We can organize at the ballot box or on the streets by holding a protest. In our rebel roles, we can engage in direct action, such as occupying vacant homes, like the Oakland, California group, Moms for Housing. And in our helper roles, we can support unhoused families in reclaiming empty homes and putting vacant houses into land trusts. When we work together on the goal of housing for all, we will win a world that is better for all of us. A world where there are no peopleless homes and no homeless people. We just need to make the mental jump to get there.